In this module, we'd like to address the concept of gender and how it underpins many of the health practices that men engage in. However, to begin with, the first short presentation here will look at gender and what it means in terms of how to be a man, particularly in Ireland, as it's based on information garnered from Irish data. I would recommend, if you have time, although it's not obligatory, to have a look at the gender code, which is situated underneath this presentation on the blog site. It is about an hour long. However, it's incredibly illuminating in terms of understanding the subtle ways in which gender is continually enacted in Western cultures and popular culture in particular, but also about the last quarter of an hour of the presentation looks specifically at how it's enacted in sport, which I think is particularly relevant for you as trainees coming onto this Men on the Move training program. So if you have watched the gender code, you'll understand that gender and our gender is a social construct. We learn how to be a girl or a boy in the context of the society in which we live, work and play. And as Erving Goffman says, there's nothing natural about gender identity. We don't pop out of the womb with gender imprinted on our genes. The process of gendering throughout our lives is fluid, it's dynamic, it's continual, and it is not fixed, I suppose, is the key message there. And when trying to improve men's health through policy and practice, what is synopsized on this slide are the things that we need to know and understand about male gender. And the first point is that many of the health practices that men engage in are themselves mechanisms for doing gender, or as Goffman says, displaying gender. Therefore, if we want to influence those practices, we need to understand gender from a male perspective. It's also important to know that these practices reflect wider cultural and institutional masculine ideologies, and therefore it is possible that we need to influence cultural shifts or institutional change in order to influence men's health practices. And the other piece here is that a man's masculine identity, it's not fixed. It's a dynamic, fluid ideology that within the context of any one man's life, he may present himself differently, or what it means to be a man may differ for him in different contexts. And I suppose to give an example of this might be that, in many environments, it isn't socially acceptable for a man to cry. So for example, at the end of the movie Titanic, it's improbable that the cinemas are filled with crying males. However, in a sporting context, at victories and at losses, it is not uncommon to see men express raw sadness and emotion, and in that environment, it is deemed socially acceptable in most environments. In most societies. So there is a multiplicity of masculinities, or I suppose there are many, many ways in which to be a man and display gender norms within any one society. There's also value in adopting a relational approach to gender and looking at, again, as human beings, we are social human beings, we interact with members of the same sex and members of the opposite sex, and we need to look at the culture and the relations between the individuals within a society to understand the gender process. But we also need to understand how gender interacts with other social determinants of health, such as class and ethnicity. So what might be normal for men in a lower socioeconomic class, perhaps with respect to alcohol consumption, might be deemed somewhat unacceptable for men in a higher social class with respect to the same behaviour. So there is an intersectionality between gender as a social determinant of health and the other determinants of health, all of which need to somehow inform both health policy and practice in order to improve men's health. One of the first and most significant pieces of research conducted on men's health and masculinities in Ireland was conducted by Dr. Noel Richardson. In the report entitled Getting Inside Men's Health that was published back in 2004, it gave us a real insight into what it meant to be a man in Ireland and a boy growing up in Ireland, and how young boys and young men learned gender norms within the context of Irish society and culture. And some of the things that we learned from this report was that men considered gender as something that they do rather than who they are. And in this quote by Ray, a 38-year-old man, he recalls that when he was younger, you didn't talk about things. If you were upset or down or suffering in some way, you just didn't talk. At least I didn't talk about them anyway. So for this man, when he was younger, he certainly learned that in order to be a young man in Ireland, it meant that when you were upset or down or suffering in some way, you just didn't talk. And that this in somehow was normal to being a young man in Ireland. The report also highlighted the importance of a public display of masculinity, and in this particular quote, again, an older man remembering his youth, he speaks of a fight at school, but he remembers getting hammered and the humiliation. I wasn't at all concerned that I got the crap beat out of me. It was the humiliation that went with it. My pride was completely hammered. So here we have a 47-year-old man recalling an incident that could be 3 decades earlier in his life, and he's still remembering the humiliation and the fact that his pride was hammered because he was not able to win this particular fight in a very public way. But notably, the fact that he got the crap beat out of himself, that physically in some way he was hurt at the end of this is not what mattered. What mattered was the humiliation and the fact that he wasn't able to win this fight publicly. It's also evident that for men in Ireland, and indeed elsewhere, as we know from other research, that displaying gender is often a collective practice. So as Philip, a young man of 22, says, it's who you're hanging around with. Like if there's a session happening, you don't want to miss it. Like you don't want to be the one to miss it. You don't want to be the one missing out, maybe being seen to not being up for it. This notion of being part of a group is really important for young men, and the sense of belonging. And as Garrett says, that in order to have that sense of belonging, that lads and groups will do things that they'd never do as individuals. I think it's, when referring to late night street fighting, the mob mentality, especially when there's drink involved. So again, in order to be part of this group, to have this sense of belonging, these young men and possibly boys will do things that they wouldn't ordinarily do, especially when there's drink involved. And for some men, their masculinity or their gender was viewed as very much a fixed entity in their lives. So as Leo says here, like there's none of us men here now going to change. It's already been hammered into us, directly and indirectly. That's just the way we are. He recognizes that nurture has had something to do with the teaching and the learning of how to be a man, and it's been hammered into him for his life, directly and indirectly, and it's beyond changing at this point. That's just the way we are. Paul, on the other hand, associates that fixed nature of his masculinity with actually, nature. So he says it's feeling that you're a bit soft if you run to the doctor. You're afraid of being laughed at, being accused of being a hypochondriac. And where does that come from, do you think? Well, it's something inbred in men, I suppose. It's in our genes. So for both of these men, while one recognises that his masculinity has been a nurtured process in his life that has been hammered into him, the other sees it quite differently, saying that it's just the way men are. We're inbred, it's in our genes, it's in our makeup. But for both of these men, how they are as men is fixed, and they are not going to change. And here we have Tim describing that how he learned to be a man was that he needed to have some way to self-contain. So he has a self-containment image that he can somehow hide behind so that he can deal with his own problems. And this is reiterated by Ray, who talks about a natural barrier system that comes down. And this notion of dealing with one's own problems by oneself, of not talking, of not being concerned about physical pain or hurt, suffering in silence, is something that resonates with some of the other quotations that I've presented to you here today. And if you could just even pause for a moment to consider, how might these lessons that men and boys learn in most westernized cultures at least impact on their health practices and therefore their health outcomes? And according to Will Courtney, a man who does gender correctly would be relatively unconcerned about his health and well-being in general. He would see himself as stronger, both physically and emotionally, than most women. He would think of himself as independent, not needing to be nurtured by others. He would be unlikely to ask others for help. He would spend much time out in the world and away from home. The intense and active stimulation of his senses would be something he would come to depend on. He would face danger fearlessly, take risks frequently, and have little concern for his own safety. I think this is a powerful quote that succinctly synopsizes the hegemonic masculine ideal, and I think it certainly prompts me, and I would hope prompts most practitioners, to ask the question, why? Why would men, or why do many men engage in health practices that put themselves at risk and lead to poor health outcomes for them, with the subsequent consequence for them and for those they love? Because I think as practitioners, by adopting the salutogenic approach that asks why rather than apportioning blame, we are better placed to support men to modify their behaviours for the benefit of themselves and those who love them and their broader community.